لقد حاولت عيش حياتي بطريقة ما، ثم كما تعلم، قاموا خلال الطلاق بنشر أكاذيب فظيعة. أكاذيب فظيعة، مثل القول إن.
For more than a year, Ben Affleck said almost nothing about the end of his marriage to Jennifer Lopez. No statements, no interviews, no hints dropped to friendly reporters. Then, in the spring of 2025, he sat down for a GQ cover story and finally answered the question everyone had been asking since the divorce filing landed on their second wedding anniversary. What actually happened to Bennifer 2.0? What he said wasn't a bombshell. It was something quieter, and in some ways more revealing, because it wasn't designed for headlines. This is the story of how two people describe the same ending in two very different ways, and what that gap tells us about what actually broke. To understand why the ending mattered so much to the public, it helps to remember how unlikely the beginning was. Affleck and Lopez met on the set of the film Geely in the early 2000s, got engaged, became one of the most photographed couples in the world, and then called off the wedding days before it was set to happen in 2003. They split for good in 2004 and went on to marry other people. Affleck to Jennifer Garner, with whom he had 3 children, and Lopez to singer Mark Anthony, with whom she had twins. 2 decades later, in 2021, they reconnected, and the reunion became its own cultural event. They married in Las Vegas in July 2022, then held a larger ceremony for family and friends in Georgia a few weeks later. For a couple whose first attempt at marriage had been derailed partly by overwhelming media attention, the second attempt started under exactly the same spotlight, just with 2 extra decades of fame layered on top. That context matters, because when the marriage ended, it didn't end quietly. Lopez filed for divorce in August 2024, listing their date of separation as April 26th of that year. The divorce was finalized in January 2025, and the two were legally declared single in February. In the months between the filing and the finalization, neither of them spoke publicly about why it had happened. That silence is what made the interviews that followed feel significant, not because of any single dramatic line, but because it was the first time either of them addressed it directly. When Affleck's GQ profile was published on March 25, 2025, it wasn't built around a tell-all confession. If anything, Affleck spent much of the conversation trying to lower the temperature around his own life. Asked about the breakup, he pushed back on the idea that there had to be a dramatic explanation. There's a tendency to look at breakups and want to identify root causes or something, he told the magazine. The truth is much more quotidian than probably people would believe or would be interesting. The line that ended up traveling furthest, though, came from a different source, a documentary Lopez had released months earlier, The Greatest Love Story Never Told, which chronicled her album and her relationship with Affleck. In one clip from that film, Affleck compared their different relationships to fame, saying you don't marry someone who lives at sea and then object to the water. In the GQ interview, he was asked to explain that comment and clarified that it wasn't meant as an accusation. He said he'd used the line to describe an attitude difference between them, not a specific incident, and made a point of saying the moment shouldn't be read as the explanation for the divorce. It's not like you can watch that documentary and go, "Oh, now I understand the issues that these two had," he said. He also used a phrase that became something of a shorthand for the entire split. There's no scandal, no soap opera, no intrigue. It's a notable thing to say publicly, given how much speculation had filled that vacuum for over a year. Tabloid theories about affairs, financial disagreements, and incompatible lifestyles. Affleck's version was less cinematic. He described their differences as more a matter of degree than substance. Two people who genuinely cared about each other but approached visibility, privacy, and public life differently. He didn't frame himself as a victim of Lopez's fame, and he didn't frame her as the reason things fell apart. He described the split in his words as ordinary, the kind of incompatibility that ends a lot of relationships, just playing out with more cameras pointed at it than most. If Affleck's comments were understated, the timing of Lopez's divorce filing was the opposite, impossible to read as random. She filed on August 20th, 2024, which was the exact 2-year anniversary of their wedding ceremony in Georgia. Whether or not that date was chosen deliberately has never been confirmed by either party, but the coincidence didn't go unnoticed by entertainment reporters. who flagged it immediately as a striking detail in an otherwise procedural legal document. What the filing also revealed was that the couple didn't have a prenuptial agreement, meaning that under California community property law, assets and earnings from the marriage were, at least in principle, subject to standard divorce proceedings rather than a prearranged split. That detail doesn't tell us much about why the relationship ended, but it does say something about how the two of them entered it, without the kind of financial hedge that a lot of high-profile second marriages include. It's a small data point, but it lines up with the picture both of them later described in interviews, a relationship that started with genuine investment in the idea of a second chance, not a calculated arrangement. While Affleck didn't speak publicly until March 2025, Lopez had already addressed the split 5 months earlier in an October 2024 conversation with comedian Nikki Glazer for Interview magazine. Her comments were more emotionally direct than his would later be. She described the period around her separation as, in her words, probably the hardest time in her life, and said that after years of feeling like she'd finally reached a stable place in her career and personal life, everything had unraveled at once. "My whole world exploded," she said, describing the gap between where she thought her life was headed and where she actually ended up. She didn't name Affleck directly in the interview, but she spoke at length about learning to feel complete without being partnered, something she said had taken her 3 decades to understand. She also told Glazer she wasn't looking to date anyone, framing the period less as heartbreak on display and more as a deliberate stretch of self-reflection. The interview came out while Lopez was also promoting the album and documentary tied to the beginning of her reunion with Affleck, which meant she was processing the end of the relationship publicly at almost the same moment she was still promoting art about its beginning, an unusually compressed timeline for anyone, let alone someone doing it in front of an audience. Taken together, the 2 interviews show 2 different paces of processing the same event. Lopez spoke first and spoke about the emotional impact. Affleck spoke later and spoke about the structural mismatch. Neither account contradicts the other. They're just answering different questions. She was describing what it felt like to live through the collapse of a plan. He was describing why he thought the plan hadn't worked. It's worth being careful not to read more into that gap than is actually there. People process breakups differently, and the fact that one person needed longer to speak publicly doesn't necessarily mean one version is more honest than the other. Just a few weeks after the GQ story ran, Affleck was back in the spotlight, this time promoting The Accountant 2 at its Los Angeles premiere in April 2025. Reporters expected him to keep steering away from the topic of Lopez. Instead, on the red carpet with Entertainment Tonight, he brought her up unprompted while talking about his kids attending the premiere alongside Lopez's twins. "Jennifer Lopez is spectacular, great to my kids, great ongoing relationship with them," he said, adding that he considered her an enormously important, tremendous person of a lot of integrity, whom he adored and was grateful to. It's a notable contrast to the more clinical language of the GQ interview, and it's worth taking at face value rather than treating it as some kind of strategic reversal. The simplest explanation is usually the right one. Divorced parents who are actively co-parenting often do end up speaking warmly about each other in public, specifically because they want their kids to see that the family didn't collapse just because the marriage did. Affleck's comments focused almost entirely on Lopez's relationship with his children, not on the marriage itself, a distinction that lines up with what he'd said weeks earlier about not wanting the divorce to be treated as a story with villains. Praising her as a parental figure to his kids and describing the marriage as ordinary and low drama aren't actually in tension with each other. They're consistent with someone trying to keep 2 separate things, the failed marriage and the intact family, from blurring into one narrative. Following the premiere, several outlets reported, citing a source familiar with the situation, that Affleck considered the GQ interview his final word on the subject and didn't plan to revisit it. It's worth treating that kind of second-hand sourcing with some caution, since it wasn't a direct quote from Affleck himself, but it does line up with the pattern of his actual public behavior since he hasn't given another extended interview specifically about the divorce, and his public comments about Lopez have stayed limited to brief, warm remarks tied to their children rather than further explanation of what went wrong. That restraint is arguably the most consistent thread across the entire story. Both Affleck and Lopez had every incentive, commercially and otherwise, to keep talking. Interviews about a headline-grabbing divorce tend to generate attention, and attention sells magazines, tickets, and streams. Instead, both of them said their piece once, in their own time, and then largely moved on to talking about their kids, their work, and their own next chapters. Lopez continued releasing music and taking on new film and producing projects. Affleck kept working across acting, directing, and producing, including projects he'd already had in motion with longtime collaborator Matt Damon. Strip away the tabloid framing, and what's left is a fairly ordinary story told by two extraordinarily famous people. A couple who reconnected after 20 years, married quickly, and then discovered, as plenty of couples do, on a much less public scale, that shared history and mutual affection aren't always enough to make two very different approaches to life fit together. Lopez spoke about the emotional toll of watching a hopeful new chapter collapse. Affleck spoke about the practical reality of a lifestyle mismatch. He says he went into with his eyes open. Neither version paints the other person as a villain, and both of them, notably, chose respect over blame when they finally did speak. The wedding anniversary filing date will probably always read as a pointed detail, whether or not it was intentional. The ship captain line will probably keep getting quoted out of context, stripped of the clarification Affleck gave about it in the same interview. And the world exploded quote will keep getting treated as more dramatic than the fuller conversation, in which Lopez was mostly talking about resilience and self-sufficiency, not despair. What actually happened, based on what both of them have said on the record, looks less like a scandal and more like two people who tried a second chance, gave it their genuine effort, and found that some incompatibilities don't disappear just because the love is real. Affleck put it plainly enough back in March. The truth here isn't the interesting part. The two people involved handling it with this